The night I decided to take the back roads home, I should have known better. It had been a long day at work, and I was eager to avoid the traffic on the main highway. The alternate route was longer, winding through a series of rural towns and unlit stretches of road, but it was quiet, almost soothing. At least that's what I told myself as I turned off the main drag and onto the narrow, two-lane road. The first hour was uneventful. The soft hum of my car's engine and the occasional croak of frogs from nearby marshes kept me company. The road was lined with tall trees that formed a canopy overhead, their branches blocking out what little moonlight there was. Around 11:30, my headlights caught something ahead. A car pulled over to the shoulder. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, their orange glow reflecting off the wet pavement. As I approached, I slowed down, debating whether or not to stop. A woman stood by the driver's side door, waving. She looked young, maybe in her late 20s, her face pale and drawn under the glare of my high beams. Her car was old, the paint peeling, and the rear bumper was dented. I rolled down my window cautiously. "Need help?" I asked. She nodded, her voice shaking as she said, "My car won't start. I don't have a signal to call for help." I glanced at my phone. No bars. Typical for this stretch of road. I told her I can give you a ride to the next town. There's a gas station there. They should have a tow truck. Her eyes darted nervously toward the trees. "Thank you," she said, climbing into the passenger seat without hesitation. As we pulled back onto the road, I noticed how quiet she was. She clutched her purse tightly, her gaze fixed out the window. After a few minutes of silence, I asked, "What were you doing out here so late?" She hesitated before replying. "I was visiting family. Took a wrong turn, I guess." Her answer seemed reasonable enough, but something about her tone felt off. I didn't press her, focusing instead on the road ahead. We drove in silence for a while, the darkness pressing in around us. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees blurring together in my peripheral vision. My GPS had stopped working miles ago, leaving me relying on my memory of the route. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see them?" I frowned, glancing over at her. "See who?" She pointed out the window, her hand trembling. "Them." I followed her gaze, but all I saw were trees and shadows. "There's nothing there," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. She shook her head, her grip on her purse tightening. "They've been following me since my car broke down." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a laugh. "It's probably just deer or something. This area is full of wildlife." Her eyes met mine, wide and unblinking. "They're not deer." Before I could respond, the car shuddered violently, the engine sputtering. I cursed under my breath, pulling over to the side of the road. The headlights flickered, casting strange, jagged shadows across the trees before going dark. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, turning the key in the ignition. The engine whined but refused to start. I tried again and again, but it was no use. We sat there in the darkness, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I grabbed my phone, but it still had no signal. "Looks like we're walking," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "The gas station's not far." She didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, her face pale. I turned to look and froze. There was someone standing in the road behind us. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the shadows. His face was obscured, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unrelenting. "We need to go," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car, my heart pounding. "Stay here," I told her. "I'll handle this." The man didn't move as I approached, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" He said nothing. I took another step closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I realized he wasn't standing on the ground. His feet were hovering a few inches above it. A wave of cold washed over me as the flashlight flickered, the beam dimming. The man tilted his head slightly, his movements unnaturally slow. Then, without a sound, he vanished. I stumbled back toward the car, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The woman was already outside, standing by the open passenger door. "We need to run," she said, her voice urgent. "They're not alone." I didn't argue. We bolted down the road, the flashlight barely illuminating the way. The darkness seemed to close in around us, the rustling in the trees growing louder, more frantic. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their forms flickering like static on a broken TV screen. Their faces were featureless, their movements erratic, like they were struggling to stay solid. We ran until my legs burned, until the road curved and the faint glow of the gas station appeared in the distance. The figures didn't follow us past the trees, but I could feel their presence, watching, waiting. The gas station clerk didn't bat an eye as we stumbled inside, out of breath and shaking. He simply nodded toward the phone on the counter and said, "Trouble on the back roads?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. The woman picked up the phone and called for a tow, her hands trembling as she dialed. When the tow truck arrived, the driver gave us a strange look. "You're lucky," he said. "Not everyone gets out of those woods." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I didn't want to know. The next day, I found a different route home. There was The highway stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, the only light coming from my headlights and the occasional passing car. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the road, lulling me into a strange mix of focus and fatigue. The radio crackled faintly, unable to hold a signal in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be a simple drive, just a late-night run to visit my sister 2 states over. I hadn't planned on leaving so late, but work had run long, and by the time I hit the road, it was nearly midnight. I figured I'd push through and make it there by morning. The first sign that something was wrong came around 2 a.m. I was driving through a particularly dark stretch of highway, the kind where trees crowd the edges of the road, their branches reaching out like claws. My phone had no signal, and I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. That's when I noticed the figure. At first I thought it was a trick of the light. The figure was standing on the shoulder of the road, right at the edge of my headlight's reach. As I got closer, I realized it was a man, tall, with a weathered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't hitchhiking, just standing there, staring at the road. I slowed down, my heart thudding in my chest. Something about him felt off. He didn't move as I passed, didn't even glance at my car. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. People walked along highways all the time, right? Maybe his car had broken down, and he was waiting for help. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me as I drove on. About 20 minutes later, I saw him again. He was standing in the same position, the same distance from the road, as if he hadn't moved. But that was impossible. I'd been driving at least 70 miles per hour, and there were no side roads or turnarounds in sight. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. This time I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tightly. My palms were slick with sweat, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. As I passed him, I resisted the urge to look, but I caught a glimpse of his face in the rearview mirror. His eyes were glowing. I pressed the gas pedal, my car surging forward. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static filling the car before fading into an eerie silence. My hands trembled as I adjusted the volume knob, but the silence remained heavy and oppressive. For the next hour I didn't see him again. The highway seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees on either side blurring together. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the unease lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Then my car started to sputter. The engine hiccuped, the headlights dimming for a moment before returning to full strength. I checked the gas gauge. It was half full. The car sputtered again, jerking slightly, and I pulled over to the shoulder, my heart sinking. The engine died as I came to a stop, the headlights flickering out. I sat there in the darkness, gripping the wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. My phone still had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching softly on the gravel behind the car. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it sounded like someone was right outside the driver's side door. I locked the doors, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned my head slowly, my eyes darting to the window. He was there. The man with the wide-brimmed hat, his face still hidden in shadow. "Open the door," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried an edge that made my skin crawl. I shook my head, my voice trembling as I said, "Go away." He knocked again, harder this time. "Open the door," he repeated. "You don't belong here." I didn't respond. Instead, I fumbled for the keys, trying to restart the engine. The car sputtered, the headlights flashing briefly before dying again. The man didn't move, his hands still resting on the window. Suddenly, the passenger side window fogged up. My breath caught as I turned to see another figure standing there, their face pressed against the glass. It was a woman, her hair matted and her eyes wide with fear. "Let us in," she whispered. "Please." I couldn't move. The car felt like a coffin, the air inside suffocating. The man outside knocked again, harder this time. "Open the door," he growled. His voice was different now, deeper, almost inhuman. I slammed my hand against the horn, the sound blaring through the night. The figures outside didn't flinch. They just stood there, watching, waiting. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The windows were clear, the road behind me empty. The car engine roared to life, and I didn't wait to question it. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. When I finally reached the next town, the sun was just starting to rise. I pulled into a gas station, my body trembling as I stepped out of the car. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside. "You okay?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't answer. I just paid for gas and got back on the road, determined to put as much distance between me and that stretch of highway as possible. I never took that route again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I catch glimpses of a figure standing by the side of the road. A tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, watching, waiting. I wasn't supposed to be on that bus. I had missed my train by seconds, the doors sliding shut as I sprinted down the platform. Frustrated and exhausted, I wandered to the station's information desk, where the clerk informed me the next train wouldn't arrive until morning. That's when I spotted the bus schedule taped to the counter. It was late, almost midnight, but the last bus to my town was still running. I debated staying at the station, but decided I couldn't stand another sleepless night on a bench. The clerk pointed me toward the station's lower level, where the buses departed. When I got there, the platform was almost deserted. The air was damp and cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The bus I needed sat idling at the end of the row, its windows dark. A driver leaned against the side, smoking a cigarette. He nodded at me as I approached, but his expression was unreadable. I boarded the bus, surprised to find it nearly empty. Only 3 other passengers were scattered throughout: a man in a heavy coat near the front, a woman with a child a few rows behind him, and an older gentleman seated in the very back. I chose a seat in the middle, dropping my bag onto the floor and leaning my head against the window. The engine rumbled to life, and the bus pulled out of the station. I settled in, hoping to doze off for the ride home. That's when I noticed the silence. The usual sounds of a bus ride. Muted conversations, the hum of the engine, the faint rustle of bags, were absent. The only noise was the occasional creak of the bus as it navigated the dark streets. Even the other passengers sat in eerie stillness, their heads bowed as if in deep thought or sleep. I told myself it was fine. Late-night buses were always a little strange, the passengers too tired or disinterested to interact. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. The lack of distraction made the ride feel endless, each turn and bump magnified by the quiet. About 20 minutes in, the bus took a sharp turn onto a narrow road I didn't recognize. I glanced out the window, expecting to see familiar landmarks, but all I saw were trees. Tall, dark pines that loomed over the bus like silent sentinels. I shifted in my seat, suddenly uneasy. The driver hadn't announced any stops, and none of the other passengers seemed concerned. I leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the road ahead, but the driver's face was hidden in shadow. "Excuse me," I said, raising my voice slightly. "Where are we?" The driver didn't respond. Neither did any of the passengers. I stood up, gripping the seat in front of me for balance as I made my way to the front of the bus. The man in the heavy coat didn't look up as I passed, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. The woman and child stared straight ahead, their expressions blank. I hesitated before stepping closer to the driver. "Hey," I said, "I think you missed my stop." The driver didn't turn his head. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, the knuckles pale. I leaned closer, trying to get a better look at his face, but all I saw was a faint reflection in the glass. A featureless blur. I said, "Excuse me," louder this time. He finally spoke, his voice low and monotone. "Sit down." Something about his tone made my stomach twist. I backed away, returning to my seat as the bus continued down the unfamiliar road. The trees outside grew denser, the darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing. I glanced at the other passengers, hoping for some kind of reaction, but they remained eerily still. The woman clutched her child's hand, her knuckles white, but her gaze never wavered. I reached for my bag, considering whether I should demand the driver stop the bus, but before I could act, the vehicle lurched to a sudden stop. The silence was deafening. I looked out the window, expecting to see a station or a roadside stop, but there was nothing. Just the dark forest stretching endlessly in all directions. The driver stood, turning to face the passengers for the first time. His face was wrong. His eyes were sunken, his skin too pale, almost translucent under the harsh interior lights. His lips twisted into a grotesque smile as he said, "This is the end of the line." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. None of the other passengers moved. The man in the heavy coat slowly rose from his seat, his movements stiff and mechanical. The woman and child followed, their eyes glassy and vacant. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Where are we?" The driver's smile widened. "You shouldn't have boarded," he said. "You don't belong here." Panic surged through me as the passengers began to move. They shuffled toward the front of the bus, their heads tilting unnaturally as they passed me. I pressed myself against the window, too terrified to move. The last passenger to pass was the old man from the back. He paused, turning his head toward me. His eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. He said, "You need to leave." Now. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, my legs trembling as I stumbled down the steps. The driver's laughter echoed behind me as I hit the ground, the cold air biting at my skin. The bus doors slammed shut, and the vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, gasping for breath, the forest around me unnervingly silent. It wasn't until I turned around that I saw the road, or rather the lack of it. The bus had dropped me in the middle of the forest, with no sign of a road or any vehicle tracks. I was alone, the towering trees pressing in on all sides. I don't know how long I wandered before I found a ranger station. The rangers were kind, offering me water and a place to sit as they asked how I'd gotten there. But when I told them about the bus, their expressions darkened. "There hasn't been a bus route through here in years," one of them said. "The last one shut down after an accident. Driver fell asleep at the wheel, took the whole bus off the road. No survivors." I stared at him, my blood running cold. "They say people still see it sometimes," the ranger added. "Late at night if you're in the wrong place. But you're lucky. Most people don't come back." I've always loved road trips. Something about the open road, the music blasting, and the promise of adventure just speaks to me. That's why I didn't hesitate when my best friend canceled on our trip last minute. I figured driving solo across a few states to visit family wouldn't be so bad. I was wrong. It was late on the second night of my trip. I'd been driving for hours, my playlist running out of songs, my eyes burning from staring at the endless stretch of highway. The GPS had taken me through a more rural route, claiming it would save time, but now I wasn't so sure. The road was dark and empty, lined with tall cornfields that seemed to go on forever. As the clock ticked past midnight, my headlights caught something on the side of the road. A hitchhiker. He was standing just beyond the edge of the shoulder, his thumb out, illuminated briefly as I sped past. He wore a dark coat and a baseball cap, his face shadowed. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. It was late, and the road was deserted. Maybe he really needed help. But something about him didn't sit right. I couldn't explain it, but the sight of him made my skin crawl. I kept driving. A few miles later, I saw him again. This time he was farther down the road, standing in the exact same position. Thumb out, head slightly tilted. My stomach tightened as I passed him, my mind racing. It wasn't possible. I'd been driving at least 60 miles an hour, and there was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe there were two hitchhikers wearing the same clothes, standing in the same eerie way. It wasn't a comforting thought, but it was better than the alternative. I pressed harder on the gas, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the cornfields swaying in the breeze. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hitchhiker running after me, but the road behind was empty. For the next 20 minutes I didn't see him again. I started to relax, convincing myself it had all been in my head. Then I rounded a curve and there he was. This time he was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. My heart pounded as I stared at him, illuminated in the harsh glare of my headlights. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there with his thumb out like he was daring me to hit him. I rolled down my window, my voice trembling as I shouted, "What the hell is wrong with you?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too wide, too forced, like his face wasn't used to making the expression. He lowered his hand, took a single step toward my car, and said, "You should take me where I need to go." His voice was low and smooth, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like an order. I slammed the window shut, shifted into reverse, and floored it. The car lurched backward, the tires struggling for traction on the uneven road. The hitchhiker didn't move, his smile frozen in place as I sped away. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 10 miles down the road. The fluorescent lights and hum of the pumps were a welcome change from the oppressive darkness of the highway. I parked near the entrance, my hands still shaking as I stumbled inside. The clerk looked up from his magazine, his bored expression turning to concern when he saw me. "You okay?" he asked. I told him about the hitchhiker, about how he'd appeared 3 times and stood in the middle of the road. The clerk frowned, scratching his head. "You say he was wearing a coat and a baseball cap?" I nodded. "You're not the first to see him," he said. "People around here call him the Traveler. They say he shows up on this stretch of road sometimes, late at night, always looking for a ride. I laughed nervously, trying to mask my fear. What happens if someone picks him up? The clerk's expression darkened. They don't. I stayed at the gas station for a while, too scared to get back on the road. Eventually, I worked up the courage to leave, figuring I'd drive straight to the next town and find a motel. The clerk wished me luck, but his tone wasn't reassuring. The highway was eerily quiet as I continued my journey. The cornfields seemed taller now, their shadows stretching across the road. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hitchhiker again, but the road behind me was empty. Then the radio crackled. I hadn't touched it, but the static grew louder, filling the car. I reached for the volume knob, but before I could turn it down, a voice came through. You should have stopped. I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. The voice was smooth, calm, and unmistakably his. You can't run forever, it said. The headlights flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a figure in the passenger seat. My breath caught in my throat as I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. When I looked again, the seat was empty. I didn't wait to question it. I hit the gas, speeding down the highway, my heart pounding with every mile. The radio was silent now, the road ahead empty. I made it to the next town just before sunrise. I checked into the first motel I saw, locking the door and pulling the curtains tight. For the rest of the day, I stayed in bed, the memory of his smile etched into my mind. I don't take road trips anymore, but sometimes late at night, I dream of the traveler. He's standing on the side of the road, his thumb out waiting, and in those dreams I always stop. There was something